So, this is my first test recording of The Scrooge of Bitcoin, A Christmas Tale, by Paul W. Samuelson. And this is commissioned through ACX for Audible.com. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. Mammy Simon hated Bitcoin. There was no doubt about it. Day after day, the rich and wicked old woman sat on a large throne at the top of her Gotham City tower, surrounded by her precious gold sacks and dozens of money-grubbing minions huddled at her feet. From her high and powerful seat in the chamber, she plotted sinister acts against Bitcoin, constantly brooding over it, then yelling in wild fits of derangement, "Bitcoin is a fraud, a Ponzi, a long-dead experiment." Indeed, Bitcoin presented a most troubling problem for her and her large investment bank. She was often seen wringing her thin, bony hands in anguish because of the digital currency. Its design and popularity threatened her elitist power and old money ways, as it promised great hope to the world for freedom and prosperity. "Minions!" Mammy Simon declared early on the day before Christmas, the very moment our story begins. From the great height of her throne, an elaborate red-cushioned chair trimmed in gold and rubies, she looked down at the dour underlings as they frantically jockeyed to be near her. "Minions, rub my dry, cracked feet, then go make me more money," she demanded. "I must find a way to destroy Bitcoin." She laughed in a graceless, grating cackle. As she did, her rotted teeth showed brown and yellow. Her creased and painted face was equally grotesque, sallow and deathly, and her two icy blue eyes, deep in their sockets, glared coldly at everything she looked upon. Making it worse, the heavy bags under her unfeeling eyes were plump with old purple blood. In short, she was beyond ripe. The only redeeming features in her appearance, if they could be called such at all, were the colourful flowing gown she wore and the green feather boa draped around her tall, withered neck. All of it beneath a stylish and gleaming silver hairdo. As she now lounged back on her throne, occasionally spraying expensive perfume into the air over her narrow shoulders, and drinking from an ornate goblet at her side. And drinking from an ornate goblet at her side as the minions did their work. Mammy Simon stroked the thin skin of her chin in deep thought, and gazed slowly around the dim circular room. The place was a barren stone and concrete chamber. It had a tall pointed ceiling, ringed high above by crouching stone gargoyles, smaller versions of the grimacing stone gargoyles on the outside of the building, which leered silently over the city. There was a lifeless black-sooted fireplace with several ancient, half-burnt logs on the grate. Fat wads of paper money were stuffed carelessly here and there into the nooks and crannies of the throne. Metal coins of all sorts overflowed from several large pots and penny jars, placed on either side of the tall chair. And above it all, a small, dimly lit chandelier on the end of a heavy chain hung down from the tall, pointed spire. Elsewhere, however, not a single Christmas tree or Christmas decoration could be found anywhere. There were no colourful lights or shiny garlands to celebrate the season. There were no red and white candy canes anywhere, or green mistletoes hanging over the doorway, or stockings on the mantel. There were no bright manger scenes, or wreaths adorned in holly, or Christmas cards freshly arrived in the mail. There was not even a note of Christmas music to lift the spirits. The place held no comforts of the season at all. The thick-walled chamber was filled to the brim with only cold emptiness. For in winter, the cold is cheap. And all of this was exactly how the proprietor liked it. The current state of affairs was just as it had been, in fact, when Mammy Simon's long-dead partner, J.P. Morg, conducted the business with her for so many years from his own gigantic throne at the centre of the chamber. And all of this was exactly how the proprietor liked it. That is so tricky. Proprietor, singularly, not a problem. Within the sentence, tricky. Exactly how the proprietor. And all of this was exactly how the proprietor liked it. The current state of affairs was just as it had been, in fact, when Mammy Simon's long-dead partner, J.P. Morg, conducted the business with her for so many years from his own gigantic throne at the centre of the chamber. They had started in a small counting house on a dark, narrow back street, and soon stole their way to shining world prominence. Even among greedy bankers, the two of them were known as greedy bankers, happiest and most agreeable when their fingers were in somebody else's wallet. But J.P. Morg had died unceremoniously of a weak spine and bad intentions, and had taken a final tight-fisted ride with the undertaker on this very day 7 years before. So the banking firm known as Simon and Morg that's tricky as well. So The banking firm, known as Simon and Morg. Simon and Morg. That is a tongue twister. So, the banking firm, known as Simon and Morg Limited, the rusted name still displayed on the outside of the imposing tower for all of the city to see. The whole ominous structure, silhouetted against the sky like a sword against God, became hers and hers alone. Not for a single moment did Mammy Simon miss her old, overfed business partner and his dramatic Baleine moustache, and she answered to the business in her own way. The chamber at the top of the tower had only one small window. Like every day, crouched at a little table next to the window in a tiny square of morning sunlight, sat Mammy Simon's chief clerk and best employee. Even though he had been a faithful servant to her for many years, her eyes set upon the innocent man and glowered at him fiercely.
"Bob Cratchit!"
she screeched at the bent figure.
"Bob Cratchit!"
she screeched at the bent figure.
"Come here and massage my jowls. Then recite to me how much fiat I hold in my coffers."
Bob Cratchit, wearing a threadbare coat, ragged old sweater, and fingerless gloves, in the chamber's dank air, sat hunched over a pile of ledger books, in which he worked his fingers raw, adding and subtracting rows and columns of bankers' numbers. The scroungy-looking man, upon his arrival at work that day, had said, "Good morning," to his boss as he lightly passed by her. The scroungy-looking man, upon his arrival at work that day, had said, "Good morning," to his boss as he lightly passed by her. He had been in quite high spirits, as it was, and he did not feel a need to creep into work submissively, as was so often the case. But these were her very first words to him. Bob Cratchit, wearing a threadbare coat, ragged old sweater, and fingerless gloves, in the chamber's dank air, sat hunched over a pile of ledger books, in which he worked his fingers raw, adding and subtracting rows and columns of bankers' numbers. The scroungy-looking man, upon his arrival at work that day, had said, "Good morning," to his boss as he lightly passed by her. He had been in quite high spirits, as it was, and he did not feel a need to creep into work submissively, as was so often the case. But these were her very first words to him. Hearing the unpleasant words in their unpleasant tone, he slowly raised his head to her, brushing aside his neglected, overgrown hair which fell over his eyes and covered his long sideburns. He was suddenly no longer in quite so lofty a mood. Only a moment later he had joyfully and longingly looked out the window, where the bright, snow-covered streets far below bustled with Christmas shoppers among the neon signs. He was suddenly no longer in quite so lofty a mood. Only a moment earlier he had joyfully and longingly looked out the window, where the bright, snow-covered streets far below bustled with Christmas shoppers among the neon skyscrapers and merrymakers in the festooned bars and restaurants, saying "Happy Yuletides" to one another over cans of grog. Only a moment earlier, he had joyfully and longingly looked out the window where the bright, snow-covered streets far below bustled with Christmas shoppers among the neon skyscrapers, and merrymakers in the festooned bars and restaurants saying "Happy Yuletides" to one another over cans of grog. Through the thin glass pane, envisaging himself strolling among these happy, well-lit crowds, a hint of laughter and cheerful Christmas music had even faintly made it to his ears amid the distant ringing of church bells. Now, though, the air in the room was filled with the old lady's disturbing voice. Her meanness showed through her every syllable as if there was an incurable boil swelling in her personality. Upon hearing his name, the pleased, far-away look in Bob Cratchit's eyes quickly changed to fright, then disgust, then defiance, as he turned and peered at the shriveled figure on the throne. Her appearance was no more inviting and forgiving than a bleached whalebone. He visibly shivered that his God-given moniker had travelled over her stale tongue and through the chasm of her ghoulish mouth, and he looked upon her with contempt. He visibly shivered that his God-given moniker had travelled over her stale tongue and through the chasm of her ghoulish mouth, and he looked upon her with contempt. This would be the moment, he decided, to speak his mind, all of his mind, as difficult as it would be and as forbidden as it was. She had pushed him into a veritable corner, and he would not wait another second, for he had something to say. "Mammy Simon," he stated with deliberation from his personal tank next to the window, "for years I have worked at the foot of your throne, putting up with your wild rantings and pilfering directives. I am now ashamed to say I simply grew accustomed to them all. For years I have worked at the foot of your throne, putting up with your wild rantings and pilfering directives. I am now ashamed to say I simply grew accustomed to them all." He grimaced in self-condemnation. "Even so," he continued, "ever since moving away from London to take this cheerless banking position, I've never said anything against you or your banking and Ever since moving away from London to take this cheerless banking position, I have never said anything against you or your banking and investment business. I've never said anything against you or your banking and investment business. I've kept my mind at a distance, at no time letting the firm of Simon & Morg Limited weigh on my conscience. But now, as of today, I have made a final decision about my future. I can put it off no longer." Mammy Simon's eyes widened in surprise that the contorted shape huddled in the square of light was talking without being told.
"Bah, Cratchit! You've been thinking?" the high-handed woman said. "And now you're Talking? Insufferable! What right have you to think and speak on my time? I don't pay you for such menial things when there's no profit in it to be seen.
She growled to herself. Then, with a mighty scowl, she clenched her teeth, speaking through her lips.
You are the overlooked man, Cratchit. You are the overlooked man, Cratchit. A mere mug in the mob. You have no choice in any matter, and that's the way it will stay because the world doesn't know you. But I do. So I will tell you what to think when I want you to think. Do you hear, servant? Until that time, lay down your pencil and commence on my jowls.
A mild-mannered and agreeable man, congenial and warm, Bob Cratchit had always been an obedient steward of the business, doing whatever his boss commanded of him from her sovereign chair. Doing whatever his boss commanded of him from her sovereign chair. He'd rarely seen her depart from the chair, in fact. It was from that high and dignified location she hatched all of her greedy schemes against the world that ruined so many lives while adding millions in profits to her own. But now, Bob Cratchit shook his head at her slowly, indicating he would not obey her command. He had reached his limit. There would be no more of such ungodly work while reading off her balance sheets and income statements or fawning over her annual reports. He would no longer avert his eyes and give in to her pressures. He would no longer bow in subservience. He would not do any of it any more. He would not do any of it any more. He had never been so insolent in her presence, and his insolence continued. "What gall have you to command anyone to do such a thing, Mammy Simon?" he asked with a slow shake of his head. "What gall have you to command anyone to do? What gall have you to command anyone to do such a thing, Mammy Simon?" he asked with a slow shake of his head. Her arrogance of position was disdainful to him. Her arrogance of position was disdainful to him. "I might be overlooked by the world, but I am happy to say I've rubbed your jaw bags for the last time. You can count and stack your own fiat too. You can count and stack your own fiat too. As of this minute, I will not toil for you any longer far up in this terrible tower." He rose from his little wooden stool at the table, a bit shakily under the circumstances, snuffing out with his fingers the small candle he used for warmth. He stood alongside the table, rubbing his gloved hands over one another, working the circulation. After a pause, as the High Lady looked down on him from her cruel, ruthless eyes, sneering and grinding her molars, he continued his impromptu resignation speech. "I rebuke you entirely, Mammy Simon," he stated, still gaining his knees. "I rebuke everything about your existence, and I will serve you no longer. Starting today, you can rely on your programmed Harvard and Yale and other Ivy League minions to massage those all-important jowls. He pointed towards the group of young people on the floor, all of them well-dressed and stylish in their modern dark blue suits and skirts, with starched white collars and fine lapels, as they looked back at him. Feast your eyes on those clustered figures there at the base of your throne, he went on. Fighting each other for the chance to knead and caress your precious feet, and proud to do it. Indeed, they can do your big city banking and bidding with their shiny MBAs and fancy economics and accounting degrees. They're young and attractive with everything ahead, fresh from their indoctrinations, yet now they cower here in Satan's nest, with all of their debt for the privilege. So let them learn their lessons. As for me, I have learned mine. I am done with your feet, and your fiat, Mammy Simon. I am done with your jowls and ledgers and shiny hair too. I don't want any of it. I don't want any of it anymore. You are the Scrooge of our time, and I hereby resign myself from this dreadful situation. Bob Cratchit, on edge throughout this whole confrontation with his long-time boss, smiled in relief that he was able to say what he wanted to say. In fact, he had no idea he had it in himself. The words had simply flowed out in some unconscious waterfall. All at once, he felt cheerful in his heart and brawny in his outlook, for, to be sure, he had done it. Meanwhile, the purple bags under Mammy Simon's smouldering eyes quivered in her sudden shock and anger.
"Bah, Cratchit!"
she cried out, looking down her up-in-the-air nose while jabbing a long crooked finger at him.
"You're defying me? Defying me? It's an unabashed humbug.
I am not some mangy dog under your dinner table," he replied. She lurched forward in her chair, still pointing at him sternly across the room.
"I pay you, and therefore I own you, Cratchit. I rule the world you live in, and I rule you. Most assuredly, you are a rotten dog, and you'll continue begging me for the scraps I drop for you right here in this tower."
She shook a veined, withered fist at him.
"So, Chief Clerk, do as I say, or I'll have you tied to these overeducated, overpriced minions, and you'll be rubbing my toes till the end of time. And you'll be rubbing my toes till the end of time."
Looking a bit surprised at being labelled in such ways, and who wouldn't be surprised by such blusterings, the fresh-faced minions at her feet began to whisper and murmur among themselves. Bob Cratchit would not back down, though. He had started something he could not go back on, and he stood tall with resolve, and a moderately good spine despite his years hunched over the tiny table. He snatched his faded hat from the corner of the table and, placing it on his head, started towards Mammy Simon with a sturdy lightness in his step to face her straight away. He moved as if he had lost some of a long-held heavy burden. Like the ghost of Christmas yet to come, he very nearly floated above the floor. Then, standing in front of her oddly captivating visage, he took a deep breath before speaking once again. Okay, I will take a pause there. And my thought at the moment is things are okay, things are quite smooth, generally pretty happy with Mammy Simon, but feeling that Bob Cratchit's lines probably need to be a little bit more hesitant in the beginning, feeling a little bit more uncertain, not sure whether to lighten his voice or not, and then to basically like illustrate that he's becoming more confident as the conversation progresses, but maybe more hesitant but a little bit faster, if that makes sense. Just less confident in one way or another. But generally, okay, I think.